welcome to tune in to my talk. GraphQL is no excuse to stop writing documentation. People often think GraphQL is a self-documenting language, or actually not really a language, but GraphQL is self-documenting as a technology. So in this talk, I'll be showing you why GraphQL is self-documenting, but I also will be asking you the question, is GraphQL really self-documenting? Or might there be additional things you need to do in order to give users all the information they need to start using and adopting your GraphQL APIs? So my name is Roy, but before I'll start telling you more about who I am, I have one question for you. What is documentation? As documentation can be many things. I also like to take away this example. So if you look at a Commodore 64, these old computers, but maybe if you remember like these older Windows versions, maybe Windows 95 or Windows 98, really depends what year you were born. Computers used to come with a user manual. And in this user manual, you could find all the information how to use your computer, instructions, maybe even screenshots, steps from A to Z on how to do something on your new computer. And remember, this is all very new. Computers were there just for a short moment, and people needed to figure out how to use computers in general. So computers came with a user manual, which can also be a part of documentation, because the creators of a Commodore 64 wanted people to understand how to use this computer. But then if you go back even way before, to the Egyptian times, or the hieroglyphs, or the Romans, the Greek, they also had documentation on how to use, or actually how to read hieroglyphs. A couple of weeks back, in the beginning of September, it was 200 years ago that we figured out how to work with hieroglyphs. And this is an example of a hieroglyph. It's also a user manual on how to do something. So documentation, user manual, instructions, they have been around for a very long time. Yeah, so first a little bit about myself. As I told you, my name is Roy. You can find me on Twitter with the handle @GetHackTeam. And I like to write and work with GraphQL, React, TypeScript, all the fancy programming languages or tools, technologies out there today. I work for a company called StepSend, which is a GraphQL as a service company, meaning that you can create a GraphQL API for basically any data source. It could be a database, SQL or NoSQL. It could be a REST API. It could also be an existing GraphQL API. So if you want to bring together different GraphQL APIs, you can do it with StepSend just by writing declarative code instead of having to write resolvers or any type of data connections yourself. I also give workshops and talk about technologies to my own company, HackTeam. You might know me from several of the other talks I've done, maybe even from my talk last year, or from any of the programming books I've written. So if you'd like to know more about what I'm doing, just head over to my Twitter account, press that follow button, or start reading to any of my old tweets. So back to what is documentation. I already showed you 2 examples of documentation. If you ask the internet, documentation is any communicable material that's used to describe, explain, or instruct regarding some attributes of an object, system, procedure as its parts, assembly, blah, 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 blah. So in short, documentation is communicable material. So it could be anything. It could be a book. It could be a documentation website. It could be even a video or maybe a podcast used to describe, explain, or instruct about a product or a procedure or your online service. So first, let's have a look about what we mean with documentation is a communicable material. So I showed you these examples about a Commodore user manual. I showed you the example about a hieroglyph stone. Or actually, I think it's a piece of paper. Probably it's even fabric, because paper was very different back in the days. So these are examples of a communicable material. It's something you can give to people. People can buy it. They can find it somewhere. It is a material they can use to get information about the product or the service or anything you like to communicate. But it can also be a website. If you go to github.com, you can find the documentation. Depending on where you are, it might look something like this. Just a website with static information telling you about GitHub, telling you about the use their separate APIs, about their products, how to get started, how to work together with people on GitHub. But if you go to IKEA or any other modern furniture store, they will also give you an instruction manual. And this is actually a joke they made to help children to build a small house inside their bedroom or just anywhere else in the house. But they give you these user manuals on how to build your new furniture. Maybe even the bookshelf behind me, it wasn't from IKEA, but it has instructions. I even have Legos back there. They also come with user manuals. So user manuals are a type of documentation. But also for GraphQL APIs, as this is a GraphQL API conference, of course. So for GraphQL APIs, you typically are using GraphQL. And GraphQL is a way to work with GraphQL APIs, to explore them, to find documentation, really to try them out, how to get started with it. And tons of the GraphQL APIs out there, they will have a graphical experience. They might even have a graphical-like experience because there are different graphical playgrounds, as I will show you later on. But first, I think a nice clap for the people behind GraphQL is at its place, because they done huge amounts of work in order to bring together everything for GraphQL 2. So the first graphical experience that you might remember, so maybe it's even the first time you're seeing GraphQL 2, the first experience really looked like the old days when GraphQL was started back in, 2015 or 2012, if you want to go even further back to the day GraphQL was actually being taught about. But yeah, the GraphQL team, they did a great work in making to sure that we have a modern graphical experience. And if you go to the GitHub discussions about this, they've done a huge amount of work to bring together separate repositories, bring together different open source projects to give us the graphical that you can start using starting like a month back. So documentation, if we go back to documentation, we saw graphical, which is a dynamic way to document APIs. But then we also have static documentation, which you might see from the user manuals from a computer, or the user manual just being there on the GitHub website. So documentation could be static and dynamic. An example of static, it's the ones I showed you. It's the hieroglyphs, it's the Commodore user manual, it's the IKEA instruction. It's also the GitHub website filled with the documentation. And then dynamic, the example of dynamic documentation could be the graphical interface we just saw, something like an API playground, because GraphQL is some sort of an API playground. Code examples that are interactive on our website, because sometimes you'll see interactive snippets inside API documentation or inside documentation of programming tools and frameworks. An example myself, I'm a huge React fan. If you go to the React website, the beta documentation, I guess, is dynamic as well. So you can make changes to the snippets they have, and then you will see something different being rendered in React. So dynamic documentation usually comes together with static documentation because you want to find both things. You want to get information about a product, but you also want to try it out. So static and dynamic documentation are ways to communicate documentation, because we already learned that documentation is any way or any shape or communicable material that you're using to give people information about your product. Because with documentation, you want to describe, explain, or instruct what your documentation starts telling about your product. So you want to describe, explain, instruct. So these three things, keep them in mind, because they will be important in the rest of this talk. Documentation used to describe, explain, or instruct. So three simple things. At first, you want to describe. You want to tell people what your product is about. Second, you want to explain. So you want to give some more information about what your project is and how it could be used. And then, most of all, with instruct, you want to give people everything they need to get started building something on top of your product. So three simple things, in my opinion, documentation should have. So first, describe. With describe, you want to tell people how they can use your product. You want to list attributes. Maybe it's a reference guide. So you have an API reference, an SDK reference. If you would go to Swagger, so Swagger is one way to instruct people about your open source or even your public REST APIs. In Swagger, you can find the reference of all the different endpoints. You can find the reference of the response, so you can find all the fields that a JSON response would have. You can also find all the HTTP status codes. And then, of course, you can find a list of all the different endpoints. So this is typically a way to describe what an API looks like if you're talking about REST APIs. So Swagger does a great job in giving you an API reference, but the same can be said for SDK reference, because SDK reference usually is a way to also do the same thing, but then explain all the different objects or functions or classes you have inside your open source library. So these are two ways to describe people what your product is. And it is a very good way to document your API in a very technical way. But as its own, people will still need to find out what they want to do and how they can do it. So describe is one way to give people a head start in your documentation, but it's not sufficient to use to tell the people using it everything they need to know to use your product. Therefore, you also need to add explanations. And explanations could be something like this. So I took this from, I think, the Kubernetes docs. It's a way to put in graphics or videos or maybe even graphs, anything you can use to give the user more explanations about your product. So if you look at this one, it's a graphic telling you how Kubernetes works, how it relates to different other parts of your architecture, how it relates to other fields or other libraries. So with explanation, you want to explain concept and producers, procedures, or maybe even something else. So explanation is really important because it gives your user more in-depth knowledge about your product. If you don't do this and you just describe, people will probably have a hard time figuring out how to actually start using your product. And then finally, you want to help them instruct. So you want to give instructions on how to use your product. So with describe, it's more like figure it out on your own. With explanation is you're giving a bit more insights on how to actually start using your product. And with instruct, you basically tell people what they should be doing from A to Z, or 1 to 3, or 1 to indefinite. So for me, I work in developer relations. Instruct is maybe the most important part of a documentation, because instruct, it will tell people how to use your product. So an example at StepSend, I put a ton of work in there to make our instruction part of the documentation as good as it can be, because you want people to know how to use your API or how to use your product. So besides describe, as I told you, it's a bit more help yourself. It's like your like a self-service part of your documentation. Explanation is for people that really want to put in the time to learn more about your product. So explanation should be very in-depth. Maybe people will even spend hours of reading it. And then instruct, it's the third part of API documentation, or just basically any type of documentation that you create. It's an instruction manual. So it will tell people how to use your product. And if you leave out this step, people probably will figure it out based on descriptions and explanations. But just imagine you're a junior developer, or maybe you're very new to a concept or to a technology. Instructions are really the best way for those kind of people to figure out how to get started. So get started is probably the most common way to instruct people on how to use a product. So it takes me back to how GraphQL APIs are typically documented. So first, and I think I asked you this hard question in the beginning already, is GraphQL really self-documenting? So if you ask people why should you adopt GraphQL, they typically tell you it solves the N+1 problem, so you have no more overfetching, underfetching, you have dynamic control over all the response fields, you have a single endpoint instead of multiple endpoints. But something else people will tell you, GraphQL is self-documenting. And in a way, it's true, of course, because GraphQL relies on a schema, and this schema is a way of documenting GraphQL APIs. But is it really self-documenting? That's the question you should really ask yourself as soon as you start using or adopting GraphQL. So with GraphQL, we have a schema, which you can see on the left side. It's just a small snippet. We have one type, and then we have two queries. So two queries to get information about a customer. Either get a full list of all customers or get a small part of a customer based on its ID. And then on the right side, you can see an introspection query. So if you go to the GraphQL specification, it will tell you about introspection queries. It's a way to query a GraphQL API, and every GraphQL API should be supporting this. And then you will get information about the schema. So as an external user of a GraphQL API, this is typically how you would get information about a GraphQL schema. Because most GraphQL schemas, they will only expose the schema and a GraphQL file internally. If you want to get information about a GraphQL API externally, you should be using an introspection query. And this will give you all the information you need to start working with this GraphQL API. And then something many APIs have done is exposing this schema through a graphical interface. And graphical will be using introspection under the hood. So if people talk about is GraphQL really self-documenting, they forget the step that graphical or Apollo Playground or GraphQL Playground or GraphQL Editor or many of the other GraphQL introspection services out there, that they are optional. GraphQL APIs don't come with GraphQL by default. You will need to enable this in the framework or the library you're using. And the trick there is that most API frameworks or libraries, they will give you some sort of playground like graphical to play with. So GraphQL isn't necessarily self-documenting. You still need to do the work to make it documented. And GraphQL is one way to expose documentation for your GraphQL API, but the only thing really baked in is the introspection query. So that's the only way people by default can introspect or actually read documentation of your GraphQL API by reading its schema. So as we figured out, graphical is optional, it isn't baked in. So maybe if you're a bit new to GraphQL, or if you've only been using one single framework to build GraphQL APIs, you were expecting that GraphQL is one way to document GraphQL APIs that is baked in. But it isn't. So GraphQL is only self-documenting up to a small amount, which is the introspection query. Because the power is really in the schema and the introspection query. The introspection query will give you access to the schema in case you're not the developer of this GraphQL API. So these two are a very powerful combination. They will help you introspect the GraphQL API. They will also help you understand whatever is defined inside the GraphQL API. So it's a way to figure out all the types that are in there, all the operations like mutations, queries, subscriptions, maybe input types, maybe interfaces. All these things you can get them from the GraphQL API just by sending an introspection query. Because introspection is a way to expose your GraphQL schema. And you can use introspection for many other ways. So an example at StepSem, we give you a way to federate GraphQL APIs declaratively. We do that by introspecting the GraphQL schemas. The same way as graphical or other tools use your introspection query to expose your schema so you can use it to figure out what is available in a GraphQL API. The same way you can use it to federate GraphQL APIs. So how does it work? You build your schema inside your GraphQL API. Maybe you do it resolver first, maybe you do it schema first. It doesn't really matter. And then the GraphQL specification gives you the information on how to introspect GraphQL APIs. And then with a tool like Graphical, you can use this introspection API to get information that you can then give to the user. You can communicate it. You create a form of documentation inside this playground that users can use to try out this GraphQL API. But the only thing GraphQL does is sending a request to your API, figuring out what its schema is through introspection. And as I told you, there are similar tools like Graphical. You have GraphQL Playground, which, if I'm not mistaken, is now merged into Graphical. You have Apollo Studio. So Apollo is an open source tool to write GraphQL APIs. They have a framework to do so. And it comes with its own studio. And then you have GraphQL Editor, which is a standalone product that you can use with all sorts of GraphQL APIs. And all these tools, what they basically do is sending an introspection query to your GraphQL API to figure out what its schema is. But is it sufficient to just use these tools? Is it enough to give your users a graphical or any of the other tools and tell them, okay, here's my GraphQL API, you can use it, this is the endpoint, and it has a graphical. So using this graphical, you can use the API, figure it out. Well, we figured out that GraphQL is documentation. So documentation for GraphQL in this case is communicable material, which graphical is, of course, because you can communicate to your users. This is my endpoint, it has a graphical, figure out how to use my API. But is it sufficient? Does it describe, explain, and instruct how to use this GraphQL API? I think if you go to graphical, it will tell you, it gives you a description because you can find the schema, you can find all the operations, and then for these operations, you can also find the types. So it describes your API. It gives you an overview of the operations and then the response types of these operations. It also instructs you because it gives you an interactive way to work with this GraphQL API. It gives you this, this part of the GraphQL interface that you see, in which you can type down queries. You can type down queries, fragments, and you will get a response of the query you put in there or the other type of operation. So for sure, it instructs you how to use GraphQL APIs, but it not necessarily explains you how to use GraphQL APIs as well. To explain is something, in my opinion, that is missing from graphical. You tell users, you describe what operations, what fields you have, you instruct so they can try them out in the player or in the playground, but you don't really explain how to use it. Of course, you have a small way of adding explanations, but it's probably more like an extended description, because when you write your GraphQL schema, you can also give some metadata. So you can tell people what a name is, so this name of this vehicle, the common name, blah, 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 blah. So they have some extra information about this field that they can use. They already know it's a string. They know the name is called name for this field. But now they also get a description on how to do it. And if you look at the operation, you can see the operation also has a description. And the way you do it is just by using schema annotations. So when you create your API, typically you do this when using schema first. You will write down descriptions of the types of the operations. You can use multi-line or single line, it's up to you. And then they will be exposed in the schema. So when graphical or a different tool is using an introspection query to get information about your API, it will be displayed something like this. But I would say it's just an enhanced explanation. So graphical is an enhanced description, sorry. So graphical and other tools, they lack in-depth explained features because in general, they are used to describe and instruct. They're missing this one single third step that we try to use, which is explain. What we're missing, graphical has no setup instructions, like for installation. They lack things to tell you about authentication. Of course, you can send headers along, but they don't really tell you how to authenticate someone for your GraphQL API. And they also lack troubleshooting. So there is no FAQ in there. There is no troubleshooting list, maybe common mistakes people make in your API. All these kind of things are something you can't put inside a graphical. As earlier we learned, documentation could be both static and dynamic. I think graphical is a good example of something that is both static and dynamic. Static as in it shows you a reference of your API, which are the operations and the types. Maybe with some extra metadata like descriptions. Also dynamic because you can try out queries in the Explorer. But most of all, graphical is dynamic. It lacks space for explanations, like I told you about installation, troubleshooting, authentication, maybe other parts. They aren't really in there. And this is space we would need for text, graphics, videos, any type of way that you want to set people up with your GraphQL API. Maybe if you want people to use your GraphQL API with front-end frameworks like React, you maybe also want to put in these kind of code snippets. Graphical in general doesn't have the space to put in these code snippets. So to explain how your GraphQL API works in depth, you would need another source of documentation. You would need maybe static documentation with these videos, graphics, videos. And you maybe build this your own. So maybe inside the documentation of your website, you build static documentation that will use graphical or any other type of playground to tell people about the usage of your API. But maybe you don't know this, you can also use tools to send an introspection query and generate a static reference to your API in a documentation page as well. So it helps you bootstrap your documentation. So it doesn't mean that you cannot create your own documentation or that you can enhance it, but it does give you a way to easily introspect the GraphQL API and use its reference to build your own static documentation. Yes. So to do so, to create static documentation, you take your schema, you take an introspection query, and then instead of creating a graphical solely, so you still use the introspection query to expose a graphical interface to your users, you can also create static documentation. So this will be on top of the documentation you have in graphical, but this time it will send to an introspection query, gets your schema, creates a reference that you can then extend using JavaScript, Markdown, CSS. The only thing it does, it creates a bundle of static JavaScript files, so a JavaScript build, or a bundle of Markdown files. It all depends on the library you're using. And this way you can easily extend it for your users so they know how to get that in-depth explanations about your GraphQL API. And there are plenty of static documentation generators out there. You have Magidoc, you have DocuQL, you have SpectaQL. So these are 3 examples, and probably if you Google there are more, but these are 3 examples I tried out myself before. So they will all let you enhance the schema by adding descriptions other than schema annotations, because you can also inject Markdown, which has text, graphics, videos. You can inject JavaScript, maybe with code blocks of examples, how to use your GraphQL API with front-end frameworks. These are all things you can do, and these can still be used together with graphical. And inside this documentation, you can even put links to your graphical, making it a combination of both static and dynamic documentation. So this way, as I told you, you can extend your documentation, you can still introspect it, so you don't need to duplicate all the references to your queries and operations. You can just extend it with text, Markdown, and JavaScript. And that way you can explain people how to do the installation of your API, how to do authentication, how to troubleshoot, maybe put contact information in there because you maybe want them to go to your Discord or your Slack channel to ask additional questions, or send you an email to request additional features, or I don't know, just to get any kind of support you would expect people to request of your API without having to duplicate anything from your GraphQL API, because you don't want to duplicate references because they're already inside your schema. And then this graphical can be used just along your static documentation. Because with graphical you can describe and explain solely, while with static docs you can describe and explain. So graphical is using to describe and instruct, not so much to explain, while your static docs are very well at explaining. And you can even use them to instruct. I left this part out, but of course in the static documentation you can write getting started guides, you can write 101s for your product. These are all things you can do inside static docs that you can't do inside graphical. So the 2 of them really go hand in hand. I think they're a match made in heaven, and you should be using both ways to document your GraphQL APIs, because otherwise you're either duplicating docs on your own website or maybe your marketing website, or you're not taking advantage of the GraphQL specification, which gives you way powerful tools using introspection. So try and use both of them, but don't try to duplicate any of the features that they have. So thank you. This is my talk. I hope to stay in touch. If you have any questions, let me know. There is a Twitter. So if you go to my Twitter page, you can ask me questions over there. And you can also find information about what I do at stepsen.com or at hackteam.io. So thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I hope pretty soon, if I would be opening your GraphQL API specification or your GraphQL API docs, that there is more than just a graphical playground, and that you haven't been duplicating any of this, but you just use the GraphQL introspection query to get a powerful documentation for your GraphQL API and a reference guide that has been introspected. So thank you.